The rain had fallen hard that night, a punishing downpour that soaked the cracked streets of the city and filled every gutter with muddy rivers. Thunder rolled above like the growl of something ancient, and lightning cut the sky into violent fragments of white. In the middle of it all was a girl so small that the storm itself seemed to swallow her. Her name was Joan. She clutched a stuffed bear that had once been soft, but was now worn to its threads, its button eyes dangling as though they too had seen far too much of the world. Her thin arms wrapped around it tightly, as if letting go meant losing the last trace of safety she had. She had known hunger for so long that her stomach no longer growled, it simply ached in silence. She had known the sting of cruel words, the heavy hand of men who saw her not as a child, but as a burden to be shoved aside. On that night, one such man had thrown her into the mud, his rough voice telling her she was worthless, telling her she would never belong anywhere but the streets. She did not argue, because she had no strength left to. She simply pressed her face against the damp fur of her bear and prayed for a place to hide from the storm. The streets were lined with houses sealed tightly against the weather, lights glowing warmly behind curtains she could not reach. She had walked past them countless times, imagining what it must feel like to step inside, to have the scent of food waiting, to have a bed that did not shiver with cold. But she knew doors did not open for children like her. Her shoes had holes, her hair clung to her face in wet strands, and her eyes told the story of abandonment far too clearly. No one wanted to see it.
Yet fate carried her feet further than she expected. Through the curtain of rain, she saw gates rising out of the storm, tall black iron against the night. Beyond them stood a mansion of glass and stone, its lights blazing defiantly against the thunderclouds, as if it refused to bow to nature itself. She had never seen such a place up close. It was the kind of house she only glimpsed in magazines thrown into trash bins, the kind of house where she imagined people lived without fear of tomorrow. She pressed her small body through the gap in the gates, slipping into a world that did not belong to her, driven by nothing more than desperation and the pounding in her chest. The garden stretched wide, filled with trees bent by the wind and fountains silenced by the storm. She did not care for its beauty. All she wanted was shelter. And then, through the sheets of rain, she saw it. At the far end of the grounds, against the wall, stood a small structure meant for a dog. It was clean, dry inside, and though she could barely see it, the thought struck her like a lifeline. A roof, 4 walls, even if meant for an animal, it was more than she had ever dared to claim as her own. Her trembling lips formed the thought before she could stop it. If she could only stay there, just for a night, maybe the storm would not take her. Maybe she would wake to see another morning. The roar of an engine broke the moment. A sleek, black Cadillac Escalade swept up the driveway, its headlights piercing the storm. The figure that stepped out carried the weight of command even in the rain. Jonathan Hayes, billionaire, a man whose decisions built towers of glass across skylines, whose fortune moved markets. He lived in a world so far removed from the girls standing in his garden that they might as well have been from separate planets. Yet there she stood, shivering in the glare of his lights, water dripping from her torn dress, clutching her bear as if it were the only thing keeping her from dissolving into nothing. For a moment, he did not move. He had come home weary from another day of negotiations, expecting silence within his walls. But silence was broken by the sight of a child who had nothing. She lifted her face toward him, her eyes wide, her voice nearly lost in the storm. She did not ask for riches. She did not beg for food. She did not cry out for pity. She only asked if she might sleep in the dog's house that night.
Jonathan felt the words cut through him more sharply than the cold. He did not even own a dog, yet here was a child ready to curl herself into straw if it meant safety. His mansion behind him gleamed with marble floors and golden light, yet it had never felt emptier than in that moment. He could have turned her away. He could have called security or the authorities. But something deeper, something long buried, stirred in him. He saw in her eyes not just need, but a reflection of the loneliness he himself had carried, masked beneath wealth and power. He guided her inside. She hesitated at the threshold, afraid her wet clothes would ruin the perfection of his home. The warmth hit her face like a wave, and she froze as though she did not deserve it. He insisted with the kind of authority she could not refuse. The marble floor gleamed under the light, polished to perfection, but for the first time, Jonathan did not care. He led her upstairs where a guest room waited, a room that had seen no visitor for years. She looked around as though she had stepped into a dream. Before bed, she was given something she had nearly forgotten existed, a hot bath. Steam rose around her as she sank into water that washed away not just the dirt of the storm, but layers of sorrow she had carried too long. Her small hands gripped the sides of the tub, afraid the warmth would vanish if she let go. When she stepped out, clean pajamas were waiting, soft against her skin. Downstairs, the kitchen offered what she thought was a feast: hot cocoa in a porcelain cup and cookies on a silver plate. She ate carefully, savoring every bite as though it might be her last. When she thought no one saw, she slipped one cookie into her pocket, saving it for tomorrow, because tomorrow had never been certain for her. Jonathan watched quietly, the weight of her small act sinking into him. That night, as thunder faded into silence, she lay in a bed too large for her, covers pulled up to her chin, her stuffed bear tucked beside her. The house that had stood as a monument to wealth now echoed with the breathing of a child who had asked only for a doghouse. She whispered her gratitude into the darkness, barely audible, yet it filled the empty halls with a warmth they had never known. Jonathan stood at the door for a long time, watching, realizing that something in his life had shifted forever. And so, the storm ended not just outside, but within. A girl who had walked through rain with nothing but a broken bear had found a roof over her head. And a man who thought he had everything discovered he had been missing the one thing that mattered. Neither knew what awaited in the days to come, but both felt the unspoken truth. This night was not chance. It was the beginning of a story that would change them both.
Morning broke with a pale light that filtered through the tall windows of Jonathan Hay's mansion, cutting across the polished floors in long golden beams. For years those beams had fallen on silence, bouncing off walls that heard no laughter, no footsteps but his own. But on this morning there was something different. The faint sound of breathing still echoed upstairs in the guest room, the gentle rhythm of a child lost in the rare comfort of safety. Joan stirred beneath the heavy covers, her small body half lost in a bed too large for her. For the first time in years, she had slept without fear that a hand would shake her awake in anger, without listening for the footsteps of those who might harm her. The storm was gone, replaced by a calm sky streaked with soft clouds, and though she clutched her bear even in her sleep, the tightness of survival had eased from her grip. The room itself seemed to hold its breath around her, as though aware of the fragile peace that had taken root. Jonathan stood in the hallway just beyond the door. He had not slept much. His mind had been restless, pulled between the routines of a life built on power and the image of the girl who had asked only for a doghouse. He had returned from countless business trips, faced negotiations with men who measured worth in millions, yet none of it had stirred him as deeply as seeing her trembling frame beneath his lights. There was something in her eyes he could not dismiss. He did not know what to call it, resilience, perhaps, or the raw truth of suffering, but it haunted him with a clarity sharper than any deal he had ever made. When Joan awoke, she moved carefully, as though expecting the comfort to be snatched away. The bed felt too soft, the pajamas too clean, the room too perfect. She swung her legs over the edge cautiously, her bare feet pressing into a rug that cushioned every step. For a moment she stood still, listening, expecting the familiar bark of orders, the shove of impatience, but none came. Instead, there was only silence, and then the faint aroma of something she had nearly forgotten existed: breakfast. Downstairs, the kitchen filled with the warmth of scrambled eggs, toast, and fresh fruit. Jonathan had never prepared such a meal himself. His staff handled such matters. But today he had insisted. He had watched too many mornings slip by in detachment. He wanted this one to mean something. When Joan appeared in the doorway, her small frame almost swallowed by the borrowed clothes she wore, her eyes widened at the sight. Food, real food, not scraps or stolen bites, but a table set as if waiting just for her. She sat down carefully, unsure if she was allowed. Jonathan motioned without a word, and she began to eat with the same quiet reverence she had shown the night before. She did not devour the meal as one starved might. Instead, she savored each bite, glancing at him between mouthfuls, as if waiting for permission to enjoy what had been given. And again, when she thought no one noticed, she slipped a piece of bread into her pocket. Old habits of survival clung tightly, unwilling to loosen their grip after years of scarcity. Jonathan saw and said nothing. He only wondered how many nights she had gone to bed hungry, how many days she had walked with an empty stomach and a heavier heart.
As days turned into weeks, Joan began to move within the mansion as if testing its boundaries. She traced her fingers along the banisters, peered through the vast windows at gardens that seemed too grand to belong to her world. She drew pictures with crayons Jonathan had bought, filling pages with crooked houses, stick figures, and always a small bear tucked into the corner. Her laughter began to echo faintly in the halls, a sound so foreign to the estate that it startled the staff at first. But shadows still lingered in her. At night she sometimes woke with a start, her eyes wide, clutching her bear as though the storm had returned. She never spoke of what haunted her dreams, but Jonathan knew. The streets had left marks deeper than the eye could see. He could provide her with food, clothes, and warmth, but he could not erase the memories that had shaped her young life. He understood that trust was fragile, that love was something she approached carefully, as if it too might vanish. Jonathan himself was changing in ways he had not expected. The mansion, once nothing more than a monument to his success, began to feel alive. He found himself lingering by her drawings on the refrigerator door, pausing at the sound of her footsteps running across the upstairs hallway. He had lived surrounded by wealth, yet had been hollow inside, carrying the loneliness of a man who built empires, but never a home. Joan's presence began to fill that emptiness, not with grandeur, but with the simple truths of childhood. One afternoon, he took her to a shopping mall in Houston. For her, it was another world. The glass storefronts sparkled with displays she had only seen from a distance, mannequins dressed in clothes too clean, too bright, to ever be hers. She walked close to him, clutching her bear, eyes wide with wonder and uncertainty. Jonathan guided her into a store and began selecting clothes for her. Dresses, shoes, coats, things she had never owned. She tried them on shyly, staring at her reflection as though it were someone else she was seeing. For the first time, she saw herself not as a child of the streets,
but as someone who could belong in a place of light. Yet the past was never far behind. In the corner of the mall, a pair of men noticed her. Their eyes narrowed, their expressions darkened with recognition. These were men who had used children like Joan, who had sent them into streets with begging bowls, who had taken what little they earned and left them with bruises when it was not enough. They saw her now, dressed in clothes far beyond what she had ever worn before, and greed sparked in their gaze. Jonathan noticed their stare, the way Joan shrank behind him instinctively. He knew without asking who they were. The men did not approach then, but their presence was a shadow stretching across the day. Jonathan realized that wealth alone could not shield her from everything. She carried with her a past that was not so easily abandoned, and there were those who would try to pull her back into it. That night, as he watched her draw quietly in the living room, her bear tucked beside her, he felt a determination rise in him. He had given her shelter, but now he would need to protect her from more than storms. For Joan, trust was still fragile. Each act of kindness from Jonathan was met with gratitude, but also with caution, as though she feared it could be withdrawn at any moment. She had lived too long in a world where promises were broken, where safety was an illusion. Yet slowly, carefully, the walls she had built around herself began to thin. She began to smile more freely, to laugh without covering her mouth, to run through the gardens with the abandon of a child who forgot, if only for a moment, where she had come from. But just as the storm had once revealed her to Jonathan, another storm, darker and more dangerous, was waiting. The shadows that lingered behind her eyes were not done with her. And in the quiet before that storm, Jonathan found himself standing on the edge of something he had not expected. A bond that had begun as a single night of shelter now threatened to redefine his life. He had thought himself the one offering salvation, yet each day he discovered that Joan, in her fragile courage, was saving him too. The world beyond the gates had not forgotten her, and soon it would come knocking. The day began like any other, sunlight breaking across the estate and spilling warmth into corners that had once known only silence. Joan's laughter drifted faintly through the garden as she chased butterflies, her worn bear tucked safely on the porch where she could see it. The mansion had grown used to her presence, every hallway echoing with life instead of emptiness, every meal punctuated by the small sounds of a child rediscovering joy. Yet beyond those gates, shadows stirred, waiting for the chance to reclaim what they believed was theirs. Jonathan Hayes had begun to believe the storm had passed, that safety was now hers forever. He had not underestimated the cruelty of the world, but he had overestimated the distance his wealth could put between them and danger. On an afternoon heavy with the heat of Houston's summer, he allowed Clara Mitchell, a social worker he had come to trust, to take Joan for a scheduled appointment. Clara was kind, her voice soft enough to coax words from Joan's guarded lips, her patience deep enough to make a child who had known only harshness believe in compassion again.
The city, however, is a place where safety can fracture in an instant. As Clara walked Joan toward the clinic, a van pulled sharply to the curb. The doors slid open, and in a blur of motion, men stepped out, rough hands seizing the girl before she could even cry out. Clara screamed, fighting to pull her back, but the force was too much. Within seconds, Joan was dragged inside, the bear falling from her arms to the pavement, and the van sped away, tires screeching. The streets swallowed the sound, leaving Clara trembling, clutching the toy as though it were the child herself. When Jonathan received the call, the world shifted beneath him. He had faced losses in business, battles with rivals, storms in the market that threatened his empire, but nothing compared to the cold, hollow silence that filled him as Clara's voice broke through the phone, telling him what had happened. Rage surged, But beneath it lay a deeper terror, that Joan, who had only just begun to taste the sweetness of safety, had been thrown back into the darkness she had fled. The kidnappers made their demands quickly. They knew who he was, knew his fortune, and demanded a ransom that to Jonathan was nothing more than a number, a sum he could produce with a signature. But it was not money they wanted alone. It was the satisfaction of power, the control of tearing a man's heart open and making him bleed helplessly. They threatened that if he reached for law enforcement, Joan would vanish, swallowed by networks that thrived in silence and shadows. Jonathan listened, but his resolve did not break. He was not a man who yielded to threats, yet he was not a man who gambled with the life of a child. He moved carefully, quietly, calling upon resources few could access. Every contact, every connection, every trace of influence he had built across decades was bent toward one purpose: bringing Joan back. Meanwhile, Joan found herself in a place that reeked of oil and rust, an abandoned warehouse along Houston's shipping docks. The air was heavy with salt and gasoline, the floor littered with broken pallets and chains that clinked faintly when the wind passed through. The men who held her were the same shadows she had once feared in the alleys, their eyes sharp with greed, their hands heavy with violence. Yet Joan was not the same girl they had known. She was still small, still fragile, but she had learned something in the weeks with Jonathan. She had learned she mattered. That belief gave her a courage she had never carried before. When the men mocked her, when they whispered of what would come if Jonathan failed them, she stared back with eyes that did not flinch. She remembered details, names, scraps of conversations they let slip. In moments when they grew careless, she repeated those details aloud, her small voice shaking them. She told one man that his sister worked at a diner, that he had mentioned it once long ago. She told another that she remembered the scar on his hand from a night he struck someone too hard. Her memory became a weapon, reminding them she was not simply a child, but a witness who could unravel them.
Jonathan moved through those days with a gravity he had not known before. His empire, once the core of his identity, seemed distant compared to the soft footsteps he listened for in the hall. Meetings were postponed, calls diverted, and for the first time in his life, he allowed business to wait, because the life of one child had revealed the hollowness of fortunes measured only in dollars. The legal process of adoption unfolded in the background, slow in its bureaucracy, yet unstoppable in its momentum. Lawyers drew up papers, judges reviewed files, and social workers visited the mansion, each step layering permanence onto what Jonathan already knew in his heart. Joan was his daughter, not by blood, not by lineage, but by the undeniable bond carved through storms, fear, and redemption. For Joan, trust was still something fragile. She walked the hallways with cautious steps. Her eyes often darted to corners as though shadows might spring from them. Yet each day, the estate bent closer to her needs. The library was transformed into a playroom where sunlight pooled across colorful rugs, and shelves filled with toys replaced the volumes of leather-bound books that once symbolized Jonathan's solitude. The staff, once discreet and distant, learned to lower themselves to her level, to speak gently, to show patience when she flinched at sudden sounds. Slowly, the empire ceased being a house and began to breathe like a home. Clara visited often, her presence a steady reassurance. Together with Jonathan, she guided Joan through small steps of healing. Nights filled with storybooks read aloud, mornings where fear was eased by routine, afternoons where laughter began to reclaim the air. Joan learned to ride a bicycle on the long driveway, wobbling at first, but straightening with determination, her triumph marked by Jonathan's applause echoing against stone walls. These were victories small to the world, but monumental to her. Proof that life no longer meant surviving, but living. The moment the adoption was finalized was quiet. Not the grand affair one might expect for a man of Jonathan's stature. In a judge's office lined with shelves of legal texts, Jonathan signed his name, and Joan, with her small hand clutching his, signed hers with letters uneven but proud. She did not fully understand the weight of the papers, but she understood his smile, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her. From that day, she was no longer just Joan Hayes by circumstance, but Joan Hayes by belonging. The mansion blossomed under this new chapter. Where once its gardens had been manicured displays of wealth, they became playgrounds dotted with swings and secret paths where Joan's laughter echoed. The dining room, long accustomed to solitary meals, became a place of warmth where plates were passed and stories were shared. Even the stern portraits of Jonathan's ancestors seemed to soften under the glow of the child who now danced in their presence.
Yet Jonathan's transformation did not stop within his walls. He had seen too clearly how many children like Joan were scattered across the city, voiceless and unseen, left to weather storms alone. The memory of her words, the plea for nothing more than a doghouse, haunted him, not as a wound, but as a call to action. With the same determination that had built his empire, he began to build something new, a foundation dedicated to children who had been forgotten. He named it Joan's Haven. Its mission was not charity wrapped in pity, but shelter built on dignity. Safe houses were established where children could find warmth without fear, education without barriers, and care without condition. Programs reached into neighborhoods long abandoned by resources, offering meals, guidance, and protection. And at the heart of it all, Joan stood as a symbol, not of tragedy, but of resilience. Her story, though private in its deepest details, became the heartbeat of the haven. Proof that even in the bleakest alleys, light could be found. Jonathan ensured that the haven carried her presence. A replica of the small wooden doghouse that had once been her desperate hope was placed in its courtyard, not as a monument to suffering, but as a reminder of transformation. Children played around it freely, laughing, knowing that the structure symbolized a promise that none of them would ever again need to beg for such meager shelter. For Joan, the journey of healing stretched onward. Nightmares still came, sometimes sharp enough to draw tears in the quiet hours. But each time Jonathan was there, sitting beside her bed, reminding her she was not alone. Her fears no longer defined her, and over time, strength grew where once there had been only trembling. She painted, she ran, she learned, and in her laughter was the echo of a childhood reclaimed. Years passed, and the bond between them deepened into something unbreakable. Joan grew, her eyes carrying the spark of someone who had stared into the darkness and chosen to live in the light. Jonathan aged, yet in her presence he found a vitality that wealth had never given him. Together, they reshaped not just a mansion, not just a life, but an entire community touched by their story. And when visitors came to Joan's Haven, when they asked about the doghouse in the courtyard, Jonathan would simply smile. He would not tell them every detail, for some truths belonged only to them. But he would say enough, that once a little girl had asked for nothing more than a place as humble as a doghouse, and that from that plea had risen a legacy that would outlast both of them. The storm that had brought Joan into his life had ended long ago, but its memory lingered, not as pain, but as proof. Proof that sometimes the harshest nights deliver the most unexpected dawns. Proof that love is not always born of blood, but of choice, of protection, of the relentless decision to never let go. And so the story of Joan Hayes lived on, not only in the walls of a grand estate transformed into a home, not only in the safe laughter of the children who found refuge in Jones Haven, but in the hearts of all who came to understand what it meant for a billionaire to trade silence for the sound of a child's life reborn. For at the center of it all remained a simple truth. Once upon a storm, a girl had asked for nothing but a doghouse, and instead she had been given the world.